All right, my name is Molly Newgard, and I'm the executive director here at Blue Sky, and I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for the opening of our September exhibitions, but also for our first in-person artist talk in the gallery. Yes. And since that, our last one was February of 2020, so this is a big deal, and I want to thank Gary Burnley and his wife. Where's Christine? Christine Osinski, I'm saying that correctly, right? Christine is actually a Blue Sky alum artist as well, so I thank both of them for coming all the way out here to Portland from the East Coast. Before we start, I would like to share our land acknowledgement statement. We at Blue Sky humbly acknowledge that our programming is being held on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia, the Wimmong, and Willamette rivers. Before I introduce Gary, I would like to thank our amazing and very hardworking team. So we have Harper Brokaw-Felbo, who is our new gallery manager, and yes, cheers for Harper. Harper's in charge of our membership and our outreach. And to our new exhibitions manager, C. Meyer, please raise your hand. This is Steve's third installation, so kudos. Also to thank Yu Young Zhang. Yu Young, are you? Oh, Yu Young left, but Yu Young is our stalwart intern volunteer who's been with us for several years. And to our newest volunteer, we have Ilsa Jones. So thank you. I would also like to recognize, of course, our very supportive board of directors and our volunteer exhibition committee, who have kind of persevered through the pandemic and been meeting monthly and weekly. So if you're in any of those groups, please raise your hand. Woo! Thank you. Thank you so much for all your hard work. Additionally, I'd like to thank our members, our donors, and especially our institutional funders. I would say that for our institutional funders, if they hadn't come through in the past year and a half, I'm not sure where we'd be, so we're very grateful, especially to the Miller Foundation, the Regional Arts and Culture Council, the Joy of Giving Something Fund, the Kinsman Foundation, and especially the Leonian Foundation. They provide funds that allow us to give honorariums to artists, to each exhibiting artist, and that's very important that we can do that, so thank you. Okay, and now while we're all here, I'd like to introduce our guest artist, Gary Burnley. Gary received a BFA from Washington University in St. Louis and an MFA from Yale University. A Photo Lucida Critical Mass 2020 top selection, Burnley's Unknown World is Blue Sky's choice for the 2020 Solo Show Award. And actually, I'd like to give a special thanks to Laura Moya and Audra Osborne of Photo Lucida for bringing us great photographers every year through Critical Mass. So thank you. Audra's here too. Thank you. Burnley's work is part of museum and private collections, including the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, Richmond, Virginia, the Hunter Museum of American Art, Chattanooga, Tennessee. He's part of solo and group exhibitions, including Aperture Gallery, New York City, Elizabeth Houston Gallery, New York City, Salon, Florence, Italy, among others. Burnley has been the recipient of artist fellowships and commissions from the National Endowment for the Arts, the State of Connecticut, New York State Council on the Arts, Creative Artist Public Service Program, New York City, the MTA, New York City, and Bi-State Development, St. Louis, Missouri. He just retired from teaching at Sarah Lawrence College, where he held both the Burke Chair in Art and Art History and the Whitmore Chair in the Visual Arts. Please welcome Gary Burnley.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right, with the mask and everything, it's going to be a little difficult. I actually tried to prepare some comments, some remarks that I'm going to partially be reading just because I didn't know what to expect. And then I'd just like to open it up to any kind of questions that you might have. The things that I want to talk about really have to do with generally my process, ideas that influence me, where I come from, it's very difficult to explain exactly why I make the choices that I make and how I make those choices. But they do come from an abundance of interactions with other people throughout my life and the situations that I've been in that have allowed me to see things in a particular way. I titled this exhibition The Known World, but it's probably more about worlds that I don't know. It's as much about those worlds. I really meant it to have a kind of geographical metaphor that known meaning someplace that you can understand where the boundaries are, where the limits are, where the borders are, and then someplace that you want to explore where you don't know exactly where you're going or how far it is. That's the way I think about making art. I think about trying to cross those boundaries and borders. Growing up, I felt like I had to understand something about known worlds and unknown worlds being an African American male in America. I don't think that my experience is any different than any other person of color in the sense that every single day you have to learn how to navigate these worlds. And I think that the one thing that you begin to understand is that duality is part of your identity. Identity is very much part of Western culture and trying to find it and trying to understand it. But once I began to accept that duality was just going to be part of who I was, how I saw things, it seemed as if that began to be the way in which I could understand how and why I wanted to make things. I'd always had a kind of conflict between what I saw as being the world that I lived in and this other world that art sort of represented. The Ovid story of Narcissus, I think, is about the idea of trying to overcome or transcend, understand something about putting yourself together, conflict, duality. And I think that one of the things that I take from that story is that it's not so much about opposites as it is about complements. Meaning that the way in which we start to understand the world or learn the world is not so much through things that are exactly opposite, but understanding comes from those differences between things. So that you don't really understand light unless you understand dark, black, white, cold, heat. I understand that that's the case in Portland this year. The sun. I was all prepared for this weather, and it's like, it seems perfect to me. But, I understand that you guys are starting to know something about those extremes, and maybe that starts to produce some appreciation. I think transcending those, transversing those, trying to understand where those borders are, and trying to understand complements in the way that an artist talks about color. That color is not really about opposites, it's really about complements, trying to contain or complete a circle. That one color contains everything that the other color does not, but when you put the two together, you get this fullness of understanding. And that's the way that I start to think about the work that I do. I start to think about trying to build on the notion that these two things that don't seem to have anything to do with each other will give you, through proximity, some kind of larger or richer experience with the images. I think about the work that I do as physically and psychologically trying to cross those borders, trying to work with the idea of those complements. My interest in collage, in physically joining things and attaching things, ironically, I think has to do with me trying to understand how to complete myself out of fragments, out of pieces, out of this duality that I've always felt. How can I put together pieces that begin to show something about who I am and what I want? That images have the power to shape how we see each other and how we see ourselves. And one of the primary functions of an image is to validate the world that's created within the image, to give some kind of permanence, some kind of immortality to the world that you create. And what I found interesting about collage, excuse me, is that it allowed me to create this world that I could specify and that I could live within, or I could be whoever I wanted to be within that world. And so it was about taking pieces of things that would not necessarily go together, or taking pieces of things to build this world that I wanted to make. The physicality of collage is something that is very important to me. It's also something that's difficult to sometimes translate in digital images. When I present the work, a lot of times, like up to now, in the last how many ever months we've been through this, and people are seeing it on a video, on a monitor, on a screen, or digitally, they don't really pick up on all the pieces. But it's really about covering things up. It's about exposing things. It's about cutting things. It's about taking these fragments. It's about building. And then I think that that process can be something that one can see as being very brutal, or very, some people have reacted to the work in a way in which you're being very destructive, because you're taking something and you're really picking it apart. A lot of times I'm taking an image that is recognizable. I'm taking something that has been considered to be very beautiful or very precious or very whatever, and I completely, I wouldn't say destroying it, but somebody else is saying destroying it in order to try to see if I can use some of that image to begin to go beyond just the surface of what it is and see how it connects with something else. It's probably good to talk a little bit about the work that I did before I did this work. I've been working on collage for about 20 years, in one way or another. About 15 years ago, for a period of 4 years or so, I produced hundreds of stereographic cards. I got really interested in stereographic cards after seeing a show at the Met that was about photography and the supernatural, and there was something about those images that had to do with an image being in between two worlds that really interested me. And I like the idea of the stereoscopic image because it existed within two worlds. But instead of trying to do the normal thing with it, taking an image and having two different versions of it that built this three-dimensional form, I started working with two different kinds of images to see if I could build something. I started with images of relatives of mine that I had never met. And in retrospect, I think I wasn't thinking about the ghost of them, but I was, I guess, thinking about them as ghosts, as having a presence, as existing in my life, but I'd never actually met them. So I only knew about them from what other people told me. And so I would take that image and then combine that image with some other aspect of another image, not necessarily them, but something that reflected what I thought I knew how they were. If they were kind, if they were this, if they were that, and try to create this other kind of presence. I like the fact that it was real but not real. I like the fact that it was there but it wasn't there. I like the fact that it only existed in your mind and it only existed in your memory. But in your memory, it also connected with all of this catalog of other images that you had that it was similar to, and perhaps other kinds of feelings that you had about it. And I worked on those for years. Like I said, I did hundreds of them, and I really, really like them. But they just weren't practical because I couldn't really share them with anybody. Everybody saw them differently because whether or not you have one strong eye and you have one weak eye, it isn't always the same eye. That began to affect it. The left side of your brain and the right side of your brain, that began to affect how you saw those two images when they merged. Whether one was in black or white, whether the one was on the left side or the right side of the card, all those factors made every image really individual for each person that saw it. I like that idea, but I didn't like the fact that it seemed to be something that was just too special, too elite, too hard to share, too hard to control, too hard in many ways. I also thought about the history of stereoscopic images, something that I thought was very much more democratic. That they used to be in people's parlors and you could make travel places that you never had gone before. Everybody could go someplace. And I like that kind of democratic quality. So I wound up starting to do collage as a way of trying to get some of those same kinds of things into the images, the same kinds of feelings that are there but not there, things fluctuating between different worlds. But that it would be more sustainable. It would be very much more the same. And that's kind of where I wound up and how these began to come about. I don't really work with the idea of series or projects. I'm just kind of always working on the same thing. It never seems to, I never seem to get to the end of it, and I never seem to resolve it. I don't have the one that does it, so it's like I can't pick it apart. They evolve, they happen, they change on their own, and usually the change takes place in odd ways when I'm just actually physically making things. When I'm physically putting one thing on top of another, cut out a circle, boom, something else pops through that seems to make it happen, and then they kind of go off in a slightly different direction, perhaps for a while. Identity for me doesn't seem to exist as one thing. It really ebbs and flows and changes and is affected by all the things that I can remember and happen in my life. And that those are the kinds of things that seem to make these change because of the way in which the image reminds me of something or the way in which the image begins to elicit a particular response that takes me to another time or to another place. And when I was first in art school, one of the work study jobs I had was showing slides for history classes. It was great, because I didn't have much art history. And I got all these free classes and I didn't have to write the papers for it. And I got all the lectures. It was wonderful. But my scholarship did not include room or board, so I lived at home. And I would travel from, again, one world to another world. Spend all of this time talking about beauty and art and all these great things, and then I kind of traveled back into what I thought was this other real world. There was beauty there. There was all the same kinds of things there, but trying to reconcile those two things has always been an issue in the work and an issue for me. The known world is also the title of a novel by Edward P. Jones, who is a very important writer to me. I love his work. We were born the same year, the same month, 10 days apart. I didn't realize that after I'd already read a lot of his work. And somehow I recognized the people in his stories and in his novels and understand something about the time that he writes about, the interaction that people have, the kind of way in which growing up in the middle, the latter half of the 20th century as a Black male, what that means. He writes about Washington, D.C. a lot in his short stories. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, but I remember very specifically the same kind of borders, issues of boundaries that seem to exist. 2 blocks away from me, where I grew up, was this big boulevard. And on the other side of that boulevard was a white community. The boulevard's name was Natural Bridge. And I, even as a 7-year-old, I knew it was ironic that should be called Natural Bridge. But I used to cross over the bridge every once in a while. I wanted to see what was over there. Not too many people crossed on our side of the bridge. But it was interesting because regardless of what people told me, there was not that much difference between what was going on over there and what was going on over here. I kind of was curious to find that out. There was one big difference, though, that on my side, there were lots of vacant, empty spots, vacant, empty lots, places where there seemed to be little activity. And one of the things I remember about those is that each one seemed to have some kind of big billboard or, some kind of advertisement for something that was taking place outside the borders of where it was actually being advertised. Could never figure out exactly what was going on there. Why did they want us to see this? This was before advertising got smart enough to realize that, Black people buy toasters and everything else. There's a Mad Men episode where somebody comes along and figures this out, that they could actually, sell washing machines to Black people. And they would buy it. Don Draper was just like floored. This is an amazing thing, But at first the images would always be, happy people, white people doing whatever. And I always thought, what's going on here? Are we supposed to be like them? Is this what we're supposed to want? There was always this kind of sense of, where am I in all of this? And slowly they began to change over time, and they became, Black people smoking cigarettes instead of white people smoking cigarettes. So I guess that meant that we could smoke cigarettes. But right across the street from me, oddly enough, was a vacant lot with a billboard that never changed for the whole time that I was there. And what happened was that the sunlight and the rain and the weather and everything would keep, decaying this image. And it was an image of these happy people getting out of cars, walking down this imaginary street to what seemed to be this huge church at the end of it. They had like windows like Notre Dame or something. It was just like, that's how I remember it. It was just like, and slowly that image just like came apart and just became, in the light of day, something that made me think that that other world on the other side was something also that was decaying, was falling apart. And I don't think that I ever really wanted so much to connect with it or to be in that world as much as I wanted to appreciate some of the things that were there. Sort of like my experience with the art history class. And that is that I wanted images, I wanted to be a part of this same kind of beauty that seemed to exist in these paintings, in this history, in this thing that they call art. So when I'm working, those are the kinds of things that I'm looking for. I'm really looking for moments where I can feel a kind of connection between two worlds, where I can feel a kind of presence that doesn't seem to exist in either, and then I can begin to try to understand something about how or why that first image was made, and through compliments, understand something about why each image was made. That's kind of the process that I go through. All of these images reflect that process. The specifics of each one are kind of unique, but difficult to kind of show because I couldn't pick one and say that this is a model for what I do. But what I thought I'd try to do is to open this up. Maybe you have some questions or some thoughts about what I'm saying, and then that way we could get a little deeper into whatever. Anybody? Yes?
Are they vernacular photos that you use as the base, or are they family photos or historical
They're all those things.
things?
Okay, I started off almost always using family photographs. Then I shifted a little bit and I would only use photographs that were related in one way or another to me. So, for instance, I would pick like these two larger ones are yearbook pictures.
Ah.
Yearbook pictures representing the year I graduated, so that either they were people who were in my class or they were, if they were from another school or whether it was the year that I was graduating. So I felt like I knew them, I knew something about them. But sometimes they're historical pictures, like the one directly behind me is a self-portrait with Emmett Till's. And that was kind of generated by a summer that I spent in Alabama about, I guess it was 8 years after he was killed. And I thought St. Louis was the north, but St. Louis isn't the north, St. Louis is the south. But I still thought it was the north, but everybody kept telling me, you don't fool around, you're going to Alabama, you gotta be careful, you gotta do this. And it was the first time I encountered, separate water fountains, separate bathrooms, separate all of this. And it was just, that image came about because I wanted to just kind of honor him in a way. He never had a chance to get to be as old as I am. So it's a real combination of his image and my image. So that was an historical picture, but a lot of them are just combinations. Some of them are historical, many of them are personal and family, and some of them are just kind of generic. Yeah.
Do you tend to work on one at a time from beginning to end, or do you tend to work on several at once, kind of work on it over time?
That also depends. I mean, sometimes I work on them and they just go together, like in ways that I could never have predicted. I literally start cutting something and putting something, and they start talking back and forth, and that leads me to this, and it goes very quickly. And then other times I put things down and nothing seems to happen. So they'll just sit in the studio and tell either I quit being so stubborn and change, or I force it to change somehow, but it becomes a struggle. All of them are a struggle, but some of them are just, they just happen. How they happen, I don't know. Even sometimes I pick an image, and after the fact, I do a little more research and find ways in which they are connected, either by the year in which they were made, or about the story of why the painting came about, or something about the person that's in the painting that I really didn't know about at the time. So I work both ways. There's some that have been sitting around for months, and others I might finish one in like 2 or 3 hours.
You mentioned that you're in the process of challenging or uncomfortable, and that the series kind of never stops. There's never a resolution.
Right.
So my question was, how do you feel when you know that the piece is finished? Like, is there a layer of resolution, or?
Yeah, I think individually there's a layer of resolution where for that piece, I find something that's substantial, that feels comfortable, that feels like it has changed. Like for instance, this piece I remember, it was just I did a whole bunch of different things, but at one point it just seemed to be one image, and it just seemed as if I was saying something that was comfortable enough that those two people weren't two people, they were one. And for a long time early on, I was trying to figure out a way of showing how different they are and the change that actually took place. But every time I did that, I thought it actually defeated it. Because if you saw that whole black and white yearbook picture, and if you saw the portrait at the bottom, and you looked at them, neither of them look like that. They really look so different. And yet, when they're together, they're a whole other person. So it's another beat. So it's at that point that I start to feel that it's resolved for that one. And then each one sort of has its own resolution point. But I know those differences. But I don't know if it's so important that everybody else knows those differences.
So I know you're noticing, as a book reader, that pretty much all of these have one image or at least one image that is a more complete, you could sort of see as a kind of encompassing image. And then in another one, you have sort of manipulated to fit the image that matches it. How do you decide which one is going to be the more holistic one? So, for example, you can see that one that you pointed to has a kind of cutoff edge at the top that you can see, made sure that it fits so that, it comes to two pictures stuck together. How do you decide which one is going to be which, or does it kind of just come naturally?
It just comes, and first thing it comes, usually with one cut, I'll just make a cut. Sometimes it's arbitrary, sometimes it isn't. And I'll make that cut on both ones, or a similar, two different cuts. So then I got 4 pieces. So then I started seeing how those 4 pieces fit. And inevitably one of those 4, or one of those combinations begins to do something that looks like it's whole. Then if you start to look more carefully, find out that this isn't. Like for instance, this appears to be such a clean cut, but it really isn't. But if you look close, I had another piece there, I had another piece there, and another piece. In other words, I originally had cut this all And then once I started putting them together, then I needed a little piece here, so then I went to this other part that wasn't there. Then cut that, put that in, cut this, put this in. So a lot of them have little things that are going on that fill in the pieces. So from a distance, it looks that way. But if you get up close, you can really start to see that the dots don't line up in that line. It's kind of big. Yeah.
Do all of your images have a story? And do any of your are any of the images, are you unwilling to tell that story?
I don't think I'm willing to tell it. I guess all of them have a story. Whether or not that story sometimes doesn't have anything to do with me. It has sometimes to do with the research that I found about the painting or whatever. But I don't think I've done anything that I would not say. An example of that, like for instance, this is an image that was a painting. I think it's by Seymour God, who was a painter, American painter. He painted this painting, and I read later that the two children that were in the story, or were in the painting, had died at some point, and he kind of painted this image for the family in which he was trying to remember those two. And why it got combined with my 8th grade graduation picture, I don't exactly know, but somehow I started putting things together in terms of posing for pictures, things that were kind of like ghosts of other times and other places. So there's a story there that starts to connect them, but I don't know if it's a complete narrative or that I necessarily completed. The one that's behind you is an image that the painting is actually a Fra Angelica painting of the mocking Christ. And so that kind of became the background. I mean, you can read a lot of things into why I decided to combine those two, but I had a kind of loose story in my mind, but it wasn't a complete narrative. Did that answer your question? I don't know if it.
Yeah, thank you for answering.
Yeah.
Yeah, so do I understand that you actually cut out and you have objects and pieces and you put them together? And then do you take pictures of that and let them be your see?
No, you're seeing the pieces.
Yes.
You're seeing the pieces. I mean, if you have to look at them closely, but you're seeing all the pieces that have been put together, layered one on top of another. I've been trying to do more and more things where I have this. It's really like for elementary school kids to cut out circles, and the more I use it, the more frayed it gets. And so when I cut the circle, it leaves a frayed edge. And I'm trying to actually do more of that so that you know that that edge isn't perfect, that it's been cut out and it is layered on. The one that's right behind you, you know, the colored image is one piece. It's made up of several pieces that then is put over.
There's these people, I love this one because the way it's got these little laid in sort of filling in the pieces.
But that was what I was talking about here. I started off with a much bigger piece, but I was like, I have to go back in and just find the right little
It
bit
makes
to put
this
in.
beautiful, almost like crazy. I mean, it's, you guys should look at it, it's really cool.
Sure, that was great. At a certain point before you get in it, look, you get that magic blurry or everything looks part of the whole. And then it looks like a photograph.
Right.
It sends it become like a video. So if you could just ask them how that worked for me, and then I ask a question.
Yeah,
And then 3 inches again, something that's where the answer is.
right.
So you're like a picture harvester. You like harvest, and then make things out of it. And then you see them. You don't do anything photographical after that.
Oh, I don't do anything photographically after that. No, I do often something when I'm making the pieces. In Photoshop, I may amp up the color, I may play it down a little bit, I may play with the focus. I put some things in and out of focus, but those are the pieces. Once I put them together, I'm not rephotographing. You know, I want the pieces to be as visible, the sense of the parts to be as visible as possible. If anything, I guess I'd like that to happen even more. You know, I actually like them not framed, but they're too fragile, unfortunately. Because when they're not framed, then you can really start to see much more of that. But I you know, it's like, what you gonna do? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm super interested in this process that you have because this idea of combining these two realities into this one world means that there are these two images that you pull things out of, and there's like this part, but I'm kind of curious, and maybe this is an intrusive studio question. Do you keep all of the custom pieces, scraps, as potential feature things, or are you like, I know I don't need this?
No, I kept them for a long time.
Yeah.
I kept them for a long time, but then I tell you, when I was talking before about the process of not ever knowing how to get it forward, if I keep too many of them, I start making them out of the same. And then they started, I wanted new images. I want to force myself to do it a different way so they move. So now I keep all the pieces until I'm sure I'm finished, and then I get rid of them. But in the process, they're all over the place.
I figured, yeah.
And I'm looking for, I used to put them in the trash can, and then it was like too much digging out. So now I just leave them all over the table, all over the floor, or wherever, and I'll search for that one little piece that I need to put in there. And then once that piece is finished, I force myself to get rid of it. Sometimes there's some beautiful ones that I think, oh, I can use this again. No, because I really found that in a funny way, stopped the process from going forward. Because I had already resolved something with that. And I wanted to think about moving it forward. I always think about those things as quirky things with me. I don't know how other people feel about those, but it's like I got these kind of my mind set up now. It's like now once it's done, all of that has to go, and then I start.
You mentioned that the base images kind of always have this connection to you. How do you decide what images you bring in and layer onto that?
I don't have any particular process other than looking. I'll look through lots of articles. I'm just kind of constantly looking through, and something about an image I find interesting, and then it'll trigger off another thought. What about this image and that image? Very often, when I first start thinking about it, I will actually still make little copies and put them in the stereo view and start to look at them now. Going back to, like, is there something there or not there? And again, I have to sometimes force myself, because sometimes I can like an image too much, and I really want to use this in this way. It just doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. And it's not doing it, so I have to kind of scrap it and look it through another way. But I love looking through books and looking at images and looking at, by thinking about, imagining how they could go together. The kind of differences in the worlds that existed. I said in my little statement that I was raised by a single mother, and I spent a lot of time just imagining the world different. And I guess that's all I'm trying to do. And I don't really think about my work as having necessarily a political bent, or I don't have any specific agenda. Things just happen, and that's part of who I am. But I'm not trying to make them one thing or another. I'm just trying to see where this whole process goes. Because I'm learning more every time I put up a group of work about what I'm actually trying to do. C and I were talking about this the other day. I mean, my head is always way behind my hand. So it's like, it takes me a while to figure out what I am actually trying to do. And sometimes I can articulate it well, sometimes I don't articulate it that well. But I keep trying to catch up. But 6 months from now, I'll probably know it better than I know it right now. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying, I think, is something that's very profound in terms of what is the artist's job. The artist's job, in a way, is to make sure that you're ahead of yourself. You're not just illustrating what you already know, but that you're discovering.
Yeah.
And I think, these questions and answers will really show that very, very well, that you're going into the unknown world, making discoveries.
Sure. That's all we can do. Yeah.
Right. Notice again that like a lot of these images are composed of two separate pictures. Do you ever do more than two, or what do you think maybe the most you've ever done in one in a single work?
Probably for the second one from the was it left there? Yeah, that one of my projects. That's a yearbook picture in combination with a portrait of Marie Antoinette. And then the background is another landscape that doesn't have anything to do with it. But I needed some more space there. Something that would move back there. I think this one over here, the middle, that's about 2 to 3 different kinds of pictures kind of combined. It's very subtle. That one's very subtle. This one has the background is from a different image versus the yearbook picture versus the portion thing. But probably 4 is about it, because I have a hard time keeping those together. Yeah. Because what I don't want them to do is to just go off and be about that. I really am still trying to make it feel like it's really one image, not even 2 images. So the more I put in, the harder it becomes to make it feel like it's all cohesive. But that is something that I'm thinking more and more about. This one, Watson and the Shark, which is a very famous sort of American painting. That one has about, I think, 3 in there as well.
Would you say 2 is probably most common? You say you most often only use 2?
Most often. Because there is something just about trying to, duality that is very much what I'm thinking about.
Last question. So I'm specifically looking at Edward for this question. I was wondering if you treat your background as more as historical studies or psychological spaces.
Ask that question again. I couldn't quite hear you with the mask.
Do you treat the backgrounds in your work more as historical settings or psychological spaces for the figures specifically?
I think psychological. You know, I'm really picking those landscapes because it's, again, something in relationship to if this is a person, as a whole person, what kind of world, again, would they be in? Okay. Thank you.
All right, I'm on my